our State House studio in Montgomery. I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. We are officially in the home stretch of the Alabama Legislature's 2024 regular session. There are just 3 legislative meeting days left, and all those could take place this week. Let's talk through some of the scenarios here. The House and Senate could meet Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and adjourn sine die on Thursday evening. That's what most people are anticipating. Alternatively, they could meet 2 days this week, then save one final day for the following week. Or, reverting back to the old days, they could meet 2 days this week, then save the final meeting day for after 10 days has passed, to meet for the final day. That would allow the legislature the option of coming back to override any vetoes from Governor Kay Ivey. That 10-day window was pretty much written into the legislative calendar years ago. But these days, the governor and legislative leaders work a lot more closely together. We'll know a lot more after the caucuses meet tomorrow. So, what should we expect in this likely final week of the session? I suppose we have to start with the budgets, which are still not to final passage. The $3.4 billion general fund and related bills were approved by the House last week and simply require a concurrence vote in the Senate to be transmitted to the governor. That's expected to happen relatively quickly and without fanfare tomorrow. The Education Trust Fund is a little different. Many expected the House to concur with the Senate's changes and go ahead and send the budget to the governor last week. But instead, the House voted to not accept the changes and form a conference committee to work out the differences. Plenty of folks in and around the State House are curious what might happen there with the state's $9.3 billion education budget and related bills. We are, of course, still following gambling. Remember that even though the Senate came up one vote short of passing the gambling package, it can still be brought up at any time. If it does come back up, that would probably mean that supporters of that gambling package have found the one vote that they lack. We're also watching whether the ethics reform bill will come up in a vote in the Senate. The House, led by Representative Matt Simpson, passed a pretty ambitious plan to revise the state's ethics code with the goal of streamlining and simplifying. But opposition from the Attorney General and the Ethics Commission has slowed it down in the Senate. Finally, we'll be watching the issue of workers' comp. Senator Sam Govan has legislation that for the first time would offer workers' compensation insurance to teachers and other education workers. It passed through the Senate pretty quietly, but questions are being raised about the cost to the state now that it's in the House. And there are also several bills to watch involving restrictions on sex education policies in schools and content restrictions in libraries. Those are all worth watching in the final days of the session. We caught up with Senate President Pro Tem Greg Reed about a few of these issues late last week. On that gambling vote, Reed said he felt good about it, but said some members made up their minds on the floor.
There are a lot of elements here, and I think the people of Alabama understand many of those. Some of those maybe they do not. There's a lot of stakeholders in this process, but the most important stakeholder to me is the people of Alabama. And if we're going to bring something to the Senate floor, as we did, we've got to feel very confident about it. We've got to make sure it's exactly what we want, we think is best. That's what we did as we passed out of the Senate. Now the legislation's come back different, and we'll continue to work on it. I felt confident with where we were, okay, because we wanted to come and vote. But obviously members have their own decision. Their decisions are made right there on that floor. My job is to lead them forward in a way that allows things to operate within our rules and within a program that's going to be beneficial for the people of Alabama. So that's our process.
On the ethics issue, Reed said he thinks the House bill deserves a fair hearing and that the Senate could move forward with something, including amendments.
I took out of the basket the ethics law. Okay, and it's going to be, we have a sponsor, it's going to be moving forward. Alabama needs strong ethics laws. And this process is one the House has worked on, we are now working on and have been working on in the Senate. And so the idea that we're going to be continuing to work on and debate the ethics legislation to make sure that Alabama has the strongest ethics laws possible and that they are clear and well defined is something that's going to be important. I know it's important to the Senate body. There's a lot of work been done. There's a lot of detail that is already there. I've got some very capable attorneys that are senators. They've taken this issue and are very diligent about it. The work's been ongoing other than just now. Certainly 3 days is a short window of time to accomplish anything, but as you've well seen in the past, the Senate's up to the task. So if it's a thing that we think is important, it's a House bill, we'll have the ability to deal with it, put ourselves in a place to where we can debate it, get input from all the members, and decide if it's the thing we want to move forward with.
Another issue to watch is school safety. Senator Arthur Orr is sponsoring legislation creating the school security program and providing schools the policy and legal resource tools they need to make campuses more secure. That bill could be on the House floor as soon as tomorrow. Some national school safety advocates are hoping to insert additional language that would make Alabama the 7th state to pass Alyssa's law. Named for Alyssa Alhadeff, who was shot and killed at the Parkland, Florida school shooting in 2018, the proposal would ensure schools have silent panic buttons installed for teachers and administrators, with the goal of reducing time for that first responders to get to the scene. And the systems could be used for all emergencies, not just threats. I spoke with Alyssa's mom, Lori, who founded Make Our Schools Safe earlier today.
We've passed now Alyssa's law, which is panic buttons in schools. So if there is a life-threatening emergency situation, whether it's a medical emergency or an active shooter, we empower our teachers to push a button, whether it's a app on a teacher's phone, a wearable panic button, or a hardwired panic button, and it's directly linked to law enforcement so they can get on the scene as quickly as possible to take down a threat or triage any of the victims.
That full interview later in the show. But first, I'll sit down with State Representative Leigh Hulsey. That interview when we come back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Welcome back to Capital Journal. Joining me next is State Representative Leigh Hulsey from Helena. Representative, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Well, I didn't realize until you just came down that this is your first time on Capital Journal. You were elected a couple years ago, so I'm honored to have you on for the first time. But so that being the case, can you kind of tell our audience, about your district and maybe what got you into running for state representative?
Sure. I actually just truly love public service. I think that it is a really fun and unique way to give back to a community. So truthfully, what got me started was just seeing some things that were missing back home when I ran for office the very first time as a council member, and thinking, well, if you're going to complain about them, you should get up and do something about it. So I did, and that really has started just kind of a love for public service, and I mean, here I am like 16 years later, I guess it is, doing the job, and love it just as much today, if not more, than I did when I started. My district, it encompasses Helena, Hoover, Bessemer, McCalla, and a portion of Lakeview. It is very, I think it's a fun district. It's very urban, but also very rural. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very diversely set up, or I guess I should say drawn district. It provides me with the opportunity to truly work with farmers, but also work with corporate America, so to speak. So it lets me get my hand in a whole lot of stuff, and I like that. I like the challenge.
That is interesting, because there is plenty of rural up there, but then you get into Hoover, and so that's interesting. Well, I want to talk about some of this legislation you've got moving. Well, I say moving, you've already passed 2 pretty significant bills, so let's talk about those. One has to do with criminalizing clergy, members of the clergy having sexual contact with people under the age of 19, if I have that correct. Yep. And a lot of folks, me included, might ask, well, goodness, was that already not wrong? Was that not already against some kind of law? So explain where this bill came from.
Sure, and I think actually that is probably the best question you could ask about that, because there does seem to be a lot of confusion around this particular, I guess, area. Most people do think that it's already illegal, but it is not. Well, I guess technically now it is, because it's done.
The governor has signed this into law.
Yes, it is law. But prior to that, it wasn't. It actually our law provided kind of a loophole of sorts. So in the state of Alabama, the age of consent is 16, but you're not an adult until 19. So 16, 17, and 18-year-olds are able to consent to sexual activity with anyone.
Even an adult?
An adult, a 45, 55, 30-year-old. It doesn't matter. If they're consenting, that is legal in this state. So a lot of people kind of would confuse like statutory rape with that, just thinking it was an age difference thing. It's not. It has to do with consent.
Okay.
And if they are consenting at 16 years of age, then they are allowed to do that. Specifically, unfortunately, this came about by just a few individuals contacting me about a problem locally. And I agreed to kind of tackle this and take it on, and then I started just getting phone calls from all over the state.
Really?
Yeah, and it was super hard to hear those things, but honestly, it also made me realize I need to continue to see this through for sure. But essentially what the bill does is it waives consent as a defense. So even if a 16, 17, 18-year-old were to consent to those types of activities with, say, their youth pastor, you can't use that as a defense in court. And we kind of really narrowed it down to you do have to be in a position of power or authority over the child specifically. So it's not just every child. We wanted to be careful in that. Sometimes you do have a 16-year-old at a different church dating someone that maybe is a youth pastor who is 19. And technically that law, if it just said a child, would have impacted that type of situation. So what we really were looking for was to try to hone in on the specific situation where they are in a position of power or authority over that child.
Yeah, that power dynamic is really
it's
what's problematic.
Yeah, it's the critical piece, because what you, and this is, I mean, unfortunately, this is just how this works in a lot of situations. Take it out, even outside of the churches, you'll see grooming happening up, through 15, and perpetrators will just wait until they're 16 because they know consent is 16 in this state. So they spend this time investing in them, teaching them that this is appropriate behavior, and it's not, but they're vulnerable and they take advantage of that. So we're closing the loophole.
And that's been signed into law. And we say clergy because that's sort of the technical term that gets used, and that people might think of people wearing robes and things like that. This could be any kind of pastor, youth pastor, things like that. They don't have to be wearing a robe for this to apply, right?
Yeah, it specifically uses the Rules of Evidence 505 to define clergyman. It essentially, what that does by using that definition, it catches every faith or religion, which is really important to us. But it also it stays in that realm. It doesn't get into your volunteers. It's not talking about necessarily your Sunday school teacher, but if you are ordained or commissioned in any of those roles, or you spend a large amount of your time doing that vocation for a living, then yes, it would apply to you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your clarification on that, because
Sure.
I think I wasn't entirely sure, so obviously that was needed. You have this other bill dealing with making sure that our firefighters and EMTs have the sensory training and how to deal with those with sensory issues. It's my understanding this already happens with law enforcement officers, and so you're expanding it into the world of fire and EMT. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I think this is just kind of a continuation of that. Last year, bringing the sensory bill for law enforcement. This time, it's really very similar. It addresses the exact same type of legislation, training, and it's tailored specifically to those individuals that have invisible disabilities or sensory processing disorders. And it just teaches de-escalation techniques. It teaches them to recognize symptoms or behaviors that might be kind of a red flag to, hey, let's recruit this tool to work on de-escalating the situation, calming an individual down. It's certainly not uncommon, and I can speak from experience here. Well, go ahead.
Well, now I was going to ask, like, what kind of things would be like sensory sensitivities and things?
Yeah, so a great one, honestly, would be it is not uncommon for someone who is on the spectrum. Let's just say that maybe an officer or firefighter is walking up to ask them if they could see some ID, and it's really in the way they ask the question, "Can I see your ID?" Well, no, you can't physically see it.
Okay, so
they
they're
say
perceiving
no.
something completely
Right,
different. Okay.
they're processing differently. Very logical thought processing, and so it just becomes a no. Well, they're not being defiant. All you really need to do is say, "Can you hand me your driver's license?" Totally changes that in their mind, and I think that's hard for people to understand if you haven't really spent a lot of time interacting with individuals like that. But even lights can be so overstimulating that it creates an environment where they can be prone to be very anxious, very stressed out, very overwhelmed. And I think a lot of us don't respond very well in situations where we feel like that, whether we have a disorder or not. But this just kind of teaches them to recognize those things, and then maybe step back and go, turn off their lights, turn their siren down. It's just finding those different tools to be able to navigate a conversation that makes them feel comfortable, but also equips the officer or firefighter with exactly what they need as well, so they can be successful.
Right, yeah. Well, that's also been signed into law by the governor. So, I mean, you're racking up the wins here. One that's still going in the process right now has to do with physical therapists and sort of the classifications and things that happen there. Walk me through what your bill does and where it is in the process.
Yes, so this bill is about direct access. So you have 3 different kinds of access in the country. We have what's called limited direct access, provisional direct access, and then unrestricted. Ours is limited. We are the only state in the United States that still has this type of practice. So basically what it does is, for us to go to a physical therapist right now, you have to have a referral from a doctor. There are 4 exclusions. Every state has those exclusions. It's kind of where some of them just started their process of working into provisional and unrestricted. But that was done in 2012. So this really hasn't been addressed and gotten this close to the finish line since then. Basically what it does is it would take Alabama from limited direct access to provisional direct access. And you could go to your physical therapist without a doctor referral. And as long as you are continuing to benefit from treatment, they can continue to see you and treat you. If for some reason something goes wrong or you're not benefiting from the treatment, at that point they would just need to stop treatment and refer you to a physician just to make sure there's not something else going on.
Interesting.
But that's really truly the nuts and bolts of this. It's giving people more access to the decision about how they would like to pursue their own health care. It has been proven that this will actually decrease healthcare costs because it can be preventatively used quicker. But yeah, it's mostly about giving people a little bit more freedom and also bringing us in alignment with other states. One of the things I think we struggle with here in Alabama specifically when we look at things like this is oftentimes you do have other physicians or you could really take any area of medicine, and they'll come here for school and then they'll leave the state because they can practice at a higher level of scope in another state. And what we really want to do is we want to retain these individuals. I mean, we're pouring into, investing in their education. And we want them to stay here and make Alabama home and be able to practice at the level they've been trained to practice.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, where is that in the process? We've got, it's in the Senate, I think?
It is. It's come out of Senate committee, Health Committee, and we're just waiting to get on the floor. So hopefully, we're down to 2-3 days.
Yep.
So hopefully it'll be on the calendar tomorrow or Wednesday.
Well, we'll be watching. Thanks for coming in and sharing more about these bills.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page. You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Welcome back to Capitol Journal. Joining me next is Leigh Alhadeff, founder of Make Our Schools Safe. Leigh, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'd love you to tell us about the background of Make Our Schools Safe. I know you're in several states pushing for laws to make our schools safe, but talk about how this organization came about.
So Make Our Schools Safe started after the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. My daughter was Alyssa, who was murdered that day in her English classroom. And my husband and I, we turned our pain and grief into action, and we started Make Our Schools Safe.
Now I know that I've seen on your website you've been in several states trying to urge state action on things like security systems and things like that and really nothing having to do with guns, but necessarily, ensuring our school security is hardened.
So we've passed now Alyssa's law, which is panic buttons in schools. So if there is a life-threatening emergency situation, whether it's a medical emergency or an active shooter, we empower our teachers to push a button, whether it's a app on a teacher's phone, a wearable panic button, or a hardwired panic button, and it's directly linked to law enforcement so they can get on the scene as quickly as possible to take down a threat or triage any of the victims.
And so other states have been receptive to this?
Yes, we've passed Alyssa's law now in 6 states, and we are hoping to pass Alyssa's law here in Alabama.
Now I know there was HB 216. Mr. Treadaway was sponsoring that, but we're late in the session now, and so maybe the best opportunity would be to include that language in other legislation. Is that where we are?
Yeah, so we're trying to get Alyssa's law in the big school safety bill, and we know that Alyssa's law would be an amazing standard level school safety protection for all the students here in Alabama. It's a life-saving measure. We know that time equals life, and we need to get help on the scene as quickly as possible.
Time equals life. That's interesting because you're trying to shorten, in the case of these tragic circumstances that we would hope would never happen, but we know they will, shorten the time period between when that incident begins and when law enforcement can be on the scene saving people's lives.
Yes, so we need law enforcement to go in and take down the shooter, and if there is anybody that's injured, that EMS can get on the scene as quickly as possible. On February 14, 2018, during the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, in my mind, I thought my daughter Alyssa was being taken to the hospital, but unfortunately she wasn't, and help didn't get there fast enough.
Wow. Well, it can't still be easy for you all these years later, but have you and maybe some of your other parents found it productive and a good memory to carry their memory forward, to do things like this, to advocate for things that would prevent the next tragedy from happening?
Yeah, so I know that every time that panic button is pushed, that Alyssa is saving lives, and that we keep Alyssa's memory alive forever through passing of Alyssa's law here in Alabama.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, look, we're going to be following this over the next couple of days. What is your message to those in the House and the Senate who have to make the choice about whether this law moves forward or not?
So it's so important that we put in these school safety measures like Alyssa's law, panic buttons in schools, so that we can prevent loss of life. Unfortunately, it's not if the next school shooting happens, but when. And we need to be prepared in these life-threatening emergency situations.
Alyssa's law, HB 216, but also looking at that Senate legislation, the more expansive thing that's probably more likely the vehicle. Lori, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story, and we'll be following.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts.
Moundville Archaeological Park contains the remains of one of the largest prehistoric Native American settlements in the United States. Founded around 1120, Moundville was located on the banks of the Black Warrior River, 14 miles south of present-day Tuscaloosa. A thriving ceremonial and political center of Mississippian culture, the site was occupied for more than 3 centuries, but was abandoned by the early 16th century.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night at the same time with more coverage of the Alabama legislature right here on APT. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.